The air was unnaturally still that night when David started his new job as the cemetery groundskeeper. The pale and bloated moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the endless rows of gravestones. David wasn't superstitious, but something about this cemetery felt wrong. As he closed the rusted gate behind him, he heard it for the first time, a faint, almost childlike lullaby drifting through the air. He froze, heart racing. It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakably coming from the graves. He shook it off, thinking it was just his imagination playing tricks in the silence of the night. But as he made his way across the grounds, the melody grew louder. It seemed to seep from beneath the earth itself, weaving between the tombstones, the notes soft and haunting. It clawed at his mind, unsettling him in ways he couldn't explain. That night, David barely slept. The lullaby echoed in his head, a haunting refrain that stayed with him long after it had stopped. He tossed and turned, but every time he closed his eyes, the music seemed to creep back closer and clearer. The next morning, David asked the older workers about the song. They went pale, glancing at each other before one spoke, his voice trembling. "There's a story," the old man began, "about the original gravekeeper, Jeremiah. They say he lost his mind after his family died in a fire. In his madness, he buried their charred bodies alive, believing they'd wake up. When he realized what he'd done, he hung himself in the mausoleum. Ever since, that lullaby has been heard at night, always before something horrible happens." David scoffed. "Just a story, right?" But the workers didn't laugh. They didn't even smile. That night, as darkness swallowed the cemetery once more, David heard the lullaby again, louder than before. It was no longer faint or far away. The notes twisted through the wind like whispers, pressing against his ears, wrapping around his mind. The song was closer now, as if being sung just below the surface of the graves. And then David saw it. A fresh grave, dirt still loose and unsettled, lay at the far end of the cemetery. He hadn't dug it. He hadn't even seen it earlier that day, but there it was, and the lullaby seemed to hum from beneath the soil. Against his better judgment, he approached. His heart thundered in his chest as he leaned down to inspect the dirt. No name on the gravestone, no records of a burial, no body that should have been there. The night was oppressive, the air thick with dread as he knelt closer, the lullaby growing louder still. And then, just as he was about to reach out and touch the disturbed earth, a faint voice whispered his name from beneath the grave. David stumbled back, terror gripping his chest. He ran to the office and checked the cemetery records. There was no recent burial, no explanation for the fresh grave. His hands shook as he flipped through the logs, desperately searching for something that would make sense of the madness unfolding around him. That's when he found it. The journal. Hidden deep in the bottom drawer, covered in dust and worn from age. It belonged to Jeremiah, the long-dead gravekeeper. The entries were erratic, filled with scrawled, incoherent thoughts, but one entry stood out. It detailed how Jeremiah had begun to hear a lullaby, just like David had. The song had driven him mad, leading him to dig graves for people who hadn't died yet, believing they were waiting to be buried. David's blood ran cold as he read the final entry. "They sing to me now beneath the ground. They beg me to bring them more, the living dead. I must bury them before they rise." The lullaby was deafening by now, echoing through the cemetery like a dirge for the damned. David knew what he had to do. He grabbed a shovel, intending to unearth the fresh grave and put an end to the nightmare. As he approached, he saw more graves. Fresh, newly dug, their dirt still unsettled. There were dozens of them, all unmarked, all appearing overnight with no record of burials. And the lullaby was coming from all of them now, a chorus of voices singing in perfect, horrifying harmony. With trembling hands, David plunged the shovel into the earth, digging furiously. The dirt was loose, almost as if the ground wanted to be opened to reveal the horrors below. And then he hit something solid. It wasn't a coffin. He wiped away the remaining dirt and uncovered a stone slab, etched with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The lullaby grew louder, more urgent, the voices no longer distant but right there, surrounding him. David pried the slab open, revealing a hidden catacomb beneath the cemetery. The stench of rot and decay hit him like a wave, nearly knocking him off his feet. As he descended into the darkness, his flashlight flickered, casting twisted shadows across the walls. Bodies lined the catacomb, some long dead, others disturbingly fresh. Their faces were contorted in silent screams, their mouths frozen mid-cry. And at the far end of the chamber, standing in front of an altar, was the figure of a man, hunched and rotting, swaying to the lullaby that filled the air. Jeremiah. His eyes, hollow and black, locked onto David as the song grew louder still, filling David's mind, suffocating his thoughts. Jeremiah pointed to an empty grave beside the altar, freshly dug. David tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The lullaby had him now. It was inside him, worming its way into his soul, drawing him closer to the grave that had been dug just for him. As the walls closed in, David realized the truth. Jeremiah wasn't luring him to his death. He was inviting him to join the chorus, to become part of the song. The lullaby wasn't a warning. It was a summons. The last thing David saw before the darkness swallowed him was Jeremiah's twisted smile as the dirt began to fall, burying him alive. The lullaby calls, its song a twisted promise of what lies beneath. If you can still hear it, you've been marked. Subscribe if you dare, and follow us into the shadows, where the stories never end, and neither will your nightmares.